here today with Amy Acton. Amy, thank you for joining me. It's really an honor to have you. I
Mm.
have met you in passing, but not really had a chance to get to know you, and
Mhm.
I'm excited to do that.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, good. So tell me, let's start at the beginning. I know a lot of people know you in recent years. You've
Mhm.
been a huge part of our city and state publicly, and I know you're on to other amazing things that are
Mhm.
a big part of our community here in Columbus. But I don't know if a lot of people really know your journey, your life journey, where it started, and I'd love to share
Mhm.
that with our audience. If you don't mind, let's start at the beginning and tell me a little bit about where you were raised and what your family dynamic was, and what a young Amy Acton was like.
Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge what you said. I am a very ordinary person who found herself in an extraordinary moment in history, which has sort of changed everything, except it's the same person I've always been.
Hmm.
I think, during those days that people got to know me on the press conferences, I wasn't scripted,
Hmm.
which is never happens in politics,
Hmm.
and my kids would laugh and go, "That's just mom." And the work I've done my whole life has been the same work, and it really does come from my childhood. I grew up in Youngstown,
Hmm.
Ohio. Um, in the '80s, I graduated in 1984 from high school. I'm 56 now, and it was when the steel mills had like the heyday was over, and there were these beautiful sunsets of pollution, and then everything just went dark.
Hmm.
Um, but in its heyday, Youngstown had been this really amazing city, really invested in great art museums. Warner Brothers was there. There's just all this life. Um, I was born um, to parents who really weren't quite sure they wanted to have me, and ended up getting divorced. And I had, after that, a pretty rough childhood up to the age of 12.
Hmm.
And at the age of 12, it got bad enough that we were finally removed, my brother and I.
Hmm.
Um, but back then in the days, you know, child neglect, child poverty still going on, as we know, so many kids here in Ohio living
Hmm.
in poverty. But it really affected me a lot. There were amazing people who would do things like my brother and I would be walking to school on the north side of Youngstown, and they would offer us breakfast.
Hmm.
But there are other adults who you could really watch look the other way, or they didn't want their kids
Hmm.
to play with you because you're dirty, or,
Hmm.
so it was just a very, I was just steeped in a lot of stress.
Mm.
Um,
Let me
you know,
just hop in there for a second
mhm,
because I'm curious. I think that's really important.
mhm.
There's a lot there. There always is. I find,
Yeah.
these stories that feel like you said, you're just this normal person, in an extraordinary time. And when it's your own experience, it can often feel very normalized. I
Right?
remember, being in my therapist office once, and I was like, yeah, and then my dad did this, and my parents got divorced, and whatever. And she was like, that's not normal, right?
Right.
Right, you're
It's
talking
very
about it, but
intellectualized,
yeah,
right,
right, and
right.
and you've kind of intellectualized it. So let's back up and slow down. The Youngstown thing by itself,
Mhm.
this city, this community that was vibrant, and I don't think people know that
Yeah,
part of Youngstown. I think mostly people know what happened,
right.
right? But tell me a little bit about how you remember the experience of watching that change.
I think what it was, you're surrounded, first of all, it's super ethnic.
Mm,
And I'm Jewish by background. My birth mother wasn't, but it was just this mix because it was the melting pot. My grandfather had come there from the old country, lost many relatives in the Holocaust. At the age of 21, when people said goodbye to their mom and got on a boat, and that's the last time you ever saw them.
mhm,
So people were carrying a lot, from where they came from. And there was the benefit of all those cultures coming together. So in some ways it was, the food was amazing
mhm,
and the exchange was amazing. It was so much, it felt very diverse. Um, and at the same time, you were watching a lot of people be able to work one job in a family and have a little vacation house up on the lake and have cars, and then all of a sudden that retracted.
Mhm.
So there is an overlying psychology to cities,
Mhm.
and a depression. It's, and it's one of the reasons, I'm very passionate. I still try to give back to
Mhm.
Youngstown. Um, so I was in that, um, but it was also a place with great beauty. I know you live, in Buxley, so,
Mhm.
that old sort of East Coast type of built environment. And then, and this kind of is foreshadowing of what I'm doing now. There are these beautiful parks.
Mm.
Frederick Law Olmsted did a major Mill Creek Park
Mhm.
there. Um, and so there was a huge investment during the heyday into culture and arts and a university and a life.
Mhm.
So I did get exposed to other things as well, even being poor, which
Mhm.
is one of the reasons why I'm so about common good and parks and
Mhm.
the other kinds of things that we join, libraries.
Mhm.
Big saving grace in my childhood was
Yeah.
libraries.
Yeah, so then tell me a little bit again about the childhood. So, what I'm curious about is the actual experience of that,
Mhm,
that you were a young girl,
mhm,
just a kid, and things are chaotic and
mhm.
not safe and not how they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of this is like in hindsight, but do you remember kind of what you thought at the time, what the experience was like for you at that time?
Well, I think I was very grown up for being
Mhm.
so young. Sometimes I felt like I've been less grown up from like 12 to 24 than I felt, as a kid. Um, because I read so much, I would bring a book home from the school library every day. I knew that life wasn't necessarily supposed to be this way. So I do
Mhm.
think I was able to develop skills and resiliencies, ones I pulled on during the pandemic, no doubt.
Mhm.
I'm hyper vigilant. I know what's going on. I have
Mhm.
different skill sets, which can be awful in ordinary life and
Mhm.
can't pick a dress out and overwhelmed by ordinary decisions in life, but put me
Mhm.
in a crisis and, you know,
Mhm.
you want me on your team in that
Right.
war. And my brother and I, we went without food a lot. There was all sorts of abuse and neglect. We were homeless at one point in the winter and lived in a tent. We moved quite a bit. My mom, I think, was a product of the 50s, probably didn't really want to have kids yet. Um, was an artist,
Mhm.
and I try to think back because, I don't have a relationship with her since we
Mhm.
were removed. But you know, there's probably strengths, of things that are in me that came
Mhm.
from her.
Mhm.
And, but it just got chaotic and she got into relationships that were pretty toxic.
Mhm.
Um, and my dad, he had tried to get custody of us, but back then, unless it was just like the worst circumstances, the mother always got custody.
Right.
Um, and he had his, own issues too, much more normal and more loving though, and came
Mhm.
from a family that I could later on in life connect with.
Mhm.
But I think it must have been hard for him to watch his kids go through stuff that he couldn't control. I think of that
Mm.
a lot as a parent.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so we navigated the streets. And again, it was a different time because kids did roam free and weren't in overly scheduled things. But, you know, we lived in a basement one whole summer, like, didn't see daylight.
Mhm.
We had extreme
Mhm.
circumstances. Um, and it's strange when you're a kid like that, you have such loyalty to your parents too, you love them. And again,
Mhm.
we've talked about mental health. I mean, I've done as much work as I can to
Mm.
process this in my adult life,
Mhm.
and try to understand it. And I'm a doctor as well, but
Mm.
again, to
Mhm.
understand it in a feeling way, like you're saying,
Mhm.
experience versus an intellectual way is
Mm.
very different.
Mhm.
And I don't think you ever take away the lens or the feeling states. Like they're there. Like I have to
Mhm.
process that alongside of ordinary life still.
Sure.
But you do become a little more at peace or understand yourself.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm kind of curious. I've often thought about this myself, and one of the things that I've come to believe is that
Mhm,
we have the ability to use our life and the experience to learn from, and then to create from,
mhm,
and to serve other people. It's often not seen that way, and a lot of times people get stuck when they've had hardship,
mhm,
and they attach to it, repeat it, identify with it, are victimized by it, and it can really, change the trajectory of your life. In your case, it sounds like you've really used it to serve, and to stand on and create from, and to help others, and I know that's true. But I'm wondering, this idea of growing up fast and being kind of an adult as a kid, I can relate to that. I felt
mhm,
like, that was my experience too. And over the years, people will say you're wise beyond your
mhm,
years, or you're so mature, or, whatever, things like that. And and I've wondered, how much of that really was who I was to begin with. Somebody that was
mhm,
sensitive and thoughtful and caring. It was kind of potentially how I came into the world, and then
mhm,
also formed by the life experience. And so I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts as,
mhm,
you think about being this sort of adult child. How much of that was
mhm,
circumstantial as you look at yourself today? How much of that, is created from that time? And how
mhm.
much of it maybe is just who you always were and what you were meant to be uh, to begin with?
We all know how hard that is to tease out. I can say as being a mother of 3 children, I could tell you things they were doing in utero that just totally still match up to me.
Yeah.
They're very
Right.
different temperaments as you're carrying them,
Right.
and, um and you see that there's just essences there all along. And you do wonder, the whole field of epigenetics and all these
Hmm.
things, like what memories are, we don't, there's so much we don't know, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And how the experiences of people who have gone before us are being passed on,
Hmm.
both environmentally, but you have to wonder about what
Hmm.
gets coded in us. And
Hmm.
so I do think I feel pretty much the same person
Hmm.
that I always did from my
Hmm.
earliest memories,
Hmm.
and, um but definitely when you say the repeating part, no, I mean, these I see patterns,
Hmm.
um, for better or worse, it's just being aware of them, because
Hmm.
then you can use that information or just notice,
Hmm.
"Oh, I'm feeling this." I'm very, very, um and my teams who have worked with me have really helped me trust my gut a lot more. I think as a kid, I had really good gut
Hmm.
intuitions that were
Hmm.
honed, and in the pandemic,
Mm.
and someday I'll be telling the whole story of it. It's not been the right time to tell it all, but I was able to figure things out and intuit things. I think that they're just not it's not all your thinking brain
Mhm.
or your emotional or your soulful, like, sort of heart gut. It's all
Mhm.
like one
Mhm.
axis.
Mhm.
And so there are things that are not verbal or not
Mm.
even logical sometimes that you can pick up on.
Mhm.
And I think that all must have been there. I mean, I had to, but I'm plagued by things, that I think are probably weaknesses, when I will always long for safety, and there's probably not enough safety in the world. And
Mhm.
there's certain things that I'll sort of always probably carry
Mhm. Mhm.
that, will just be hurts or disappointments or wounds that,
Mhm.
and we know no one goes through this unscathed and
Right.
doesn't wrestle with these
That's right.
things.
That's right. Okay, so tell me what happens. You're homeless and 12, and your brother and you are
Yeah.
walking around. I mean, how do you then move through your schooling and teenage years, and eventually get to college? Fill me in on that part
Okay.
of your life.
So, a lot of times people want to know when I wanted to be a doctor. But when I was 8, somewhere in that, my brother and my mom went on a trip to California with someone and then broke up when we were driving back and our car broke down. So she put us on like Greyhound buses and we were like 8 and 5. And then we had to go switch buses in Chicago or do
Mm,
crazy things.
mm,
And when I got to her parents' house, I ended up having a bad appendicitis attack and my appendix ruptured and I was hospitalized for 10 days. And I fell in love with just like the nurturing and the caring
mm,
of the doctors and nurses. So I think that's when, and somehow through books, back then there seemed to be like 10 careers you can pick from. We all know there's 10,000 job descriptions
mhm,
now, but
mhm,
there's a doctor, nurse, a
mhm,
fireman. And I just thought, I know I can be anything I want to be. So somehow I locked on that. And
mhm,
then I learned about the 6-year BSMD program. Ohio had, as many states did, an accelerated program, all the same hours, but you go all year round. And
mhm,
they compacted because there was a shortage of doctors. And so I set my sights on that even before I was removed. And being removed, that was foreshadowing for my public health career because I still thought there was like one kind of doctor,
mhm,
like a guy with white hair and a white coat. I had no idea of specialties. I had nobody telling me
mhm,
what this was like. But, and so I sort of imagine myself in that role. Ultimately, fast forward, I'm in preventive medicine, but preventive medicine is about population as your patient.
mhm,
I've worked on youth homelessness, so all homeless youth or
mhm,
all kids who need immunized or all women in a maternal and child health infant mortality setting, or in this most recent case, 11.7 million patients is
mhm,
Ohio. But it began back then. It's all about these social determinants of health. And when I got removed from the school I was in to my new school, which would be more like a Bexley,
mhm,
um, very college bound,
mhm. This is middle
this
school?
would be 7th grade.
Okay, yep.
Walked in the door, of course, didn't tell anybody about my background, okay, so
Mhm,
I'm living, like, this whole new world, which I'm
mhm.
trying to adapt to how people function and act
Right.
when I wasn't from that kind of place, and, but just that change, like, there were kids that were just as smart and as nice from my old school, but their lives went completely different trajectories. So I get pulled out, which is like this
Mm,
blessing,
mhm,
plunked into this more functional school environment and stay there for the complete set of years through high school.
mhm,
And you start to realize that by the luck of the draw, these things
mhm.
greatly change your trajectory.
It's amazing.
And
Yeah.
that's my whole passion in
Mhm,
medicine. And so I went to this new school and I just tried to blend in. I just tried to do everything right and learn how to adapt. We still weren't wealthy. We lived in an apartment. My brother and I shared a bedroom, but it was in this wealthier neighborhood. So I got to have exposure to a lot. Ultimately did get in it was a very competitive program. So I went straight to med school out of high school.
Now, sorry, let me just jump in. So, did you knew about this program like
Yeah.
in seventh grade? You knew about
Yeah.
this? Wow.
Because
I
it had
mean,
been getting some press like in the news and I'd heard about it.
uh huh. Well, I think that's fascinating that there was something that caught your attention at that
Yeah.
age. I mean, I still don't know exactly what I want to do,
No.
but you obviously had a calling, and this idea of being plucked out and the luck in that.
The luck.
Is that how you see it? Does it feel bigger than that? I don't wanna put words in your mouth,
Yeah.
but that feels bigger than luck to me. I
Yeah.
don't know, what do you think?
Well, it was even more complicated than that, and I am a very spiritual person have studied all world religions, certainly have studied Judaism, and that sense of the spirit or soul is something that's very much a part of that time and what I do, but I also told the truth.
Mhm,
So there was a moment where, um I had a decision to make, and I think part of being in those dysfunctional things is that you protect your parents.
mhm,
But things got so bad, that finally, um, one day I said some truth, and then that led me to
mhm,
a police department, that led to a whole
mm,
grand jury, and that was a very pivotal point in my life. I mean, I have very visceral memories of, like, walking into this courtroom and my shoes squeaking on the floor and,
Mhm.
like, having to be grilled hours on
Mm.
end. And this very scary guy who my mother had married, they had to, like, hold him back from, like, jumping out at me. So,
Mm.
it was just this
Mm.
ugly situation.
It's terrible, yeah.
And as a kid, trying to tell that truth, but still wanting to protect my mother too. And
Mhm.
there's a very famous scene in my life where I went to give my mom a kiss. They'd been arrested and were out on bond, and I went to give my mother a kiss, and she just turned her face away. That's the
Mm.
last time I saw her.
Wow.
And,
Jeez.
I know, and then they skipped town on bail. And back then, when you did that, you got across state lines. There was
Mhm.
no follow-up.
Mhm.
So,
Amy, it's so sad,
it is sad, and it
and
happens all over,
yeah, I mean, and
unfortunately.
you turn into this phenomenal success, but,
Mhm.
like, I don't know. I mean, this is why I like
Mm,
having these conversations because I don't know if people know that part, you know?
yeah.
People see you as so inspiring and collected and calm and compassionate, but this sadness, I mean,
Mhm.
that it's just strikes me, And you mentioned having done a lot of work. Um, and maybe you would go out of order here a little bit. It's just kind of what's coming to me is maybe you can talk about that. I mean,
Yeah.
how have you processed
Mhm.
that sadness? And I don't assume that it's like ever
Gone.
gone, right?
Right.
I mean, this
Right.
is a thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I see it in being with you right now.
Mhm.
Um, but you've done work to be able to be a highly functioning,
Right.
wonderful member of the community, mother, wife,
Yeah.
family member, whatever else, friend. How did you do that? What worked for you? What is your practice?
Well, I would say it's ever an ongoing. Um, I am not at all a perfect friend or mother or, um, but I've given it my whole heart and soul. Like, I've always given it my very best. I've often felt like, for instance, I did end up going to med school and ultimately, and those were very hard years. I had to work like 3 jobs while I was putting myself through med school. Ended up in New York City in 1990 at Albert Einstein, for this very competitive triple board program. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to do peds or child psychiatry. So I wanted to give back and I wanted to give back to kids. This was before I discovered preventive medicine. And I was in the Bronx and unbeknownst to me, like it was like the most intense moment of the crack cocaine epidemic.
Mm,
So half of the kids in my peds practice were gonna be dead by the age of 3 from contracting AIDS in utero.
mm,
And so even though I
terrible.
had grown up in these really rough circumstances, at that point, I had not seen suffering on the scale I saw in New York City at that time,
Mhm,
um, where there would be whole rooms full of incubators of babies with, like, nobody there. Like, if you
mm,
have a premature baby or your children's here, there's, like, nurses and doctors and
mhm,
parents and people surrounding each incubator, and these were just like babies laying around in a room, and it was
mm,
so devastating.
mm,
And that was the first time. I think it had been building, but that was the first time I had a panic attack. Like, there was this day where I kept going, like, I couldn't breathe, but I didn't know what it was because it was
mhm,
so painful to watch, like, this much suffering.
mhm,
And then I would get, like, so upset, I would run downstairs, um, to the ER to talk to someone down there, and then I'd feel better, but I didn't realize I'm, like, blowing off CO2, you know?
mhm, mhm,
But it was the first time I think I couldn't just put my head around it and keep going.
mhm,
Um, and I really struggled seeing that, ultimately ended up moving to Columbus to Children's Hospital here, and it was there that I had a mentor who introduced me to this whole other field I didn't know existed called preventive medicine.
mhm,
And I say all this to say, because this is really important for people to understand. When I went to med school, it was all sick care.
mhm,
It wasn't healthcare that you learn. And I remember even being in med school and they gave the World Health Organization definition of health.
mhm,
And it was a complete state of physical, emotional, and social well-being,
Mhm.
not merely the absence of disease.
Mm.
And that was just like mind-boggling
Yeah.
to me, but didn't know what to make of that. And I'd always gravitated more toward the behavioral, the
Mm.
integration of these systems.
Mhm.
So then I learned that, we gained 30 years life expectancy in the last century. So from when my grandfather was born in 1900, you were expected to live to, on average, 48.
Mhm.
He lived to 84. What happened in 1 century? Because I was like Thoreau lived to
Mm.
on Walden Pond, 48 years old, so
Right.
your age
Right,
right
right.
now. And that's your whole life expectancy. And it turns out that only 5 of those years are due to all the high-tech medical things we do. Like
Mhm.
25 of the years that we gained
Mm.
were due to clean water, safe food, child
Mm.
labor laws, all of
Mm.
these, like, goes on and on, all these
Yeah.
things that you can only solve collectively
Yeah.
as a society,
Yes, right.
and they're not in our individual control.
Right. And they're not honored. People, and I don't wanna, um I don't want to discredit the medical system,
Right,
but oftentimes in our society and in medicine, people don't connect those dots. They believe in diagnose, treat, medicate, and it seems to
that's
be
right,
an epidemic by itself in that there's just like not time, right? They don't have
mm,
time.
right,
You talk about the babies laying around. In some ways, it's still like that in that there's a waiting room full of patients and they need to be seen, and so
right,
it's not we're not really getting at the bigger problem here,
right,
which is a collective, a community. It's the integrated part, right? It's
right,
not just about, the symptom.
right,
It's about the food and the water and the love and the environment and, the nature. I mean, it's all, and you're
so
seeing this. You're learning this,
yeah, that was discovering this field, and I always knew I wanted to get at the cause behind the cause, like, I didn't wanna treat this kid for
Mhm,
3 years. I wanted to figure out how to prevent them from ever getting in that place to begin with, and that all comes from my childhood, I'm sure,
mhm,
and not wanting to look the other way at the ugly things.
mhm,
So wanting to look it in the eye, not be destroyed by it, by being overwhelmed by it, which, there are times I am overwhelmed. I said that to
mhm.
11.7 million Ohioans, like, I
Yeah,
feel it too.
yeah.
But and it's also you just said something about the individual body, like, all of that you're carrying, the emotional, the
Mhm.
physical, it's all one system.
Yeah.
And now we know that, being out in nature and smelling sap actually changes your neurochemistry.
Mhm.
Feelings of awe, feelings of
Mm.
wonder are healing. So,
Mhm.
it should be about healing, and there's an art to medicine, whether you're doing it at the individual patient level, but of course, the business of medicine. And again, the many, many great things that happened with science and the white coated scientists of the 50s
Mhm.
being able to have immunization so every mother didn't have to worry about their kid going to play in the spring and getting polio and being
Mhm.
on an iron lung.
Mhm.
And the problem is, though, when we actually prevent things, when we do a killer job and we knock it out of the park, you don't see what we prevented.
Yeah.
And
Right.
therefore, you grow complacent and forget about it. So
Right.
we take so for granted that we
Right.
turn on that tap. But when I've done global health
Yeah.
all over the world, that's not the case.
Right.
And
Right.
so, we're sort of a victim of our successes in that sense. And you saw all of this play out during the
Oh,
pandemic.
yeah. Oh, yeah. I have a question that keeps coming back to me. I wanna just ask you because 'cause I'm struck by the fact that you had such a, abusive childhood,
Mhm.
just not how it's supposed to be. You didn't have what you needed in
Right.
so many ways, in all the ways. And yet, even at the age of 13 and, 7th grade, you're thinking about, medical school and being a doctor and, as you described just even a little bit, that
Mm.
you're now, like, in competitive programs, right? The top programs. Where did you get the belief that
Right.
you were smart enough, that you were enough, that you were capable? I mean, especially as a woman.
Yeah.
where there weren't a lot of role models for what you wanted to do.
Mhm.
Where did that come from? How did you do that? How did
Yeah.
you know that you were smart enough to do the work and
Right.
to get to that place?
I don't know that I always believed it, but I wanted it so badly.
Uh-huh.
So I had this ability to just sort of will, like, it's not that I didn't have to work hard at things. I guess, my parents were very bright.
Mhm.
Um, I do think there were enough adults, like, I often talk about the random school tea I mean, everyone should talk about the random school teacher, as we've shared. My
Mhm.
husband is an elementary school teacher for
Mm.
38 years. There were enough there were teachers who didn't. I mean, I had teachers who were not nice and not
Yeah.
supportive, but there were a few people at a few key times that, like, help you. But the biggest thing for me were books, and
Mhm.
that's, again, I've been asked a lot, my favorite book, I'm always like, it's Charlotte's Web. It's,
Mhm.
like, one of my favorite stories from childhood, and I would read it over and over again, but I think being able to see other lives gave me a belief, but you have to believe it.
Mhm.
Now, I probably clung to this, I
Mhm.
might have gone a different direction. Like, I
Mhm.
think there are all other parts of myself I ended up exploring, like gardening and cooking that came later in life, that
Mhm.
things, I read endlessly. I was
Mhm.
influenced by, and during the pandemic, I would throw out, Viktor Frankl's book or
Mhm.
Joseph Campbell, or I'm
Mhm.
throwing
Mhm.
out these allusions to other things I
Mhm.
ultimately got to explore because I was on such a narrow being in
Mhm.
an accelerated program, and it was always nose to the grindstone.
Mhm.
And and so it's been in later life, and probably almost to a fault, I need to do even more now,
Mhm.
but I still drive myself so hard.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, and I think, what I'm hearing, what you said initially is just the want,
mhm.
the want to really tackle these problems and to
Yeah.
help people can really drive you.
Yeah.
Um, Tell me a little bit. I mean, the audience will probably be angry if we don't spend time talking about the pandemic, as that's
Aw.
how most people know you. I could
Right.
continue this conversation all day. I'm just fascinated in,
Aw.
the journey to that work. But, before we do that, I'm curious, I had another guest, who you probably know, Beth Weinstock,
Oh,
on
yeah.
recently,
She's
and
wonderful.
she was talking about the challenges of, being a mother and a
Oh,
physician, right? Working and owning a medical practice and trying to raise children. Talk a little bit about,
yeah.
how that went for you. Having your family and your career.
Yes.
Tell me about that experience for you.
So, you definitely being raised in the 80s was this you could have it all.
Mhm.
But I think you can have it all. And as I'd often tell my students, um, sometimes it's not all at once. I
Yeah.
really began to understand this concept of sequencing.
Mhm.
And for me, in the very early years of having my kids, you just don't know what it's going to feel like till you have them. And when I was in pediatrics, I was supposed to have, like, 2 weeks off. Even though you were in pediatrics, there was no part-time back then, and yet we learned all this about breastfeeding and what you're
Mhm.
supposed to do developmentally, and having my son Jake just changed everything for me because it was so important to be a mom.
Mhm.
And again, I felt inept a lot of time. I mean, I'm like the what to expect when you're expecting. I'm like
Mhm.
reading how to be the baby because I have no idea. I can
Mhm.
resuscitate a 24
Yeah.
week baby, but I don't know. They're slippery.
Yeah, I remember
And
when
that
our
feeling, right?
oh, yeah, when our kids were born that our, doctor said to us as we're leaving the hospital, "I stamped the instructions on his back, good luck,"
Right.
And I remember getting home that first night and, like, looking through the book, crying, crying, crying,
Right, right.
"What do you do when they're crying?" Yeah.
It's, and it's, there are no give backs. Like, this is
Right.
18 years, and you're like, all of a sudden, it's so vulnerable. You put them
Yeah.
in that car you drive, all of a sudden, every driver is horrible.
Yeah.
And and going through that, I was working really intensely and I had like childcare and people cleaning my house and stuff. And at the time I've been divorced. So I'm in a second marriage and my husband was also a doctor. And so you're balancing this crazy life. And all of a sudden
Mm,
you realize you're not living your life. Other people are living it.
mhm.
So one of the hardest decisions I ever made was to back my career down some,
Mhm.
even though I'd been so gung ho. It's the
Mhm.
best. It was the best thing I ever did. I learned whole new things, got involved in boards and charity,
Mhm.
and
Mm.
got to have some experiences with my kids of seeing what childhood should be. So,
Mhm.
and it took a lot of attention for me because I didn't have role models or
Mm.
people to fall back on.
Mhm.
So I was able to slow things down. I remember people saying, like, I mean, you this is going to ruin your career. And,
Mhm.
I'm glad I trusted my gut.
Mm.
And again, it did make a trajectory and it did change my income
Mhm.
but in the end, it was a very rich part of
Mm.
my life.
Mm.
And, that said, I did have a divorce, and that was another very hard chapter in my life.
Mhm.
That was very painful and full of things that I probably were parts of childhood
Mm.
playing out.
Mhm.
But just was able to stay focused on my kids. I just have amazing kids,
Mm.
and ultimately I've remarried
Mhm.
and have a very good experience of married life.
Mhm.
Um, and so much maturing and it not being perfect
Mhm.
and um learning and learning and learning
Mm. Mm.
about yourself.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
so that journey hasn't ended, I
Yeah.
guess I
I
just
don't know
wanna
if it ever
say.
does. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So tell me, how do you end up in the governor's office?
Okay, yeah, so
And
that's a funny
uh,
story
yeah.
because yeah, I shouldn't be there. And, so, my career in public health has taken me from public-private partnerships to global health. I was a professor at OSU. Right before I got a very strange call out of the blue, I was working at the Columbus Foundation, which I love. It was one of my favorite places because public health is about bringing all these different systems around a table to solve wicked hard problems. And at the time, I just loved it because you can really convene people. And I was working on youth homelessness, lots of things, but youth homelessness was something I felt was at a tipping point in this community. I learned that kids were not going to shelters, they were preyed upon there. So there were a lot of underlying issues that we were missing in our approach to youth. But I saw these great assets in our community with Huck House and Star House. And
Mhm.
I knew that if we could just give it a little push over the edge, and we did, we were making this great progress. And for 1 hour, unbeknownst to me, in a meeting, was one of the governor's closest confidants.
Mm.
Um, I remember she came like for 1 hour. I was very impressed by her. Her name's Anna O'Donnell, and then disappeared. So it must have been during the election.
Mhm.
And so one day out of the blue, I got this little call where Anne's on the phone and she's like, "Oh, the governor and I are standing here underneath the state house, and we're just wondering if you'll come in and talk to us." And tying this back to our conversation, I walk in this. So I'm not in politics at all.
Mhm.
And I keep joking I'm the Ted Lasso of politics because I honestly, and which was the best thing that ever happened. I knew no better and
Mhm.
got a lot done for that
Mhm.
very reason. But
Mm.
I walked into this room and all these people stood up and the
Mhm.
governor walks in the room.
Mhm.
Then he sits down at this like little table with this crumpled brown paper bag and he starts to eat his lunch. And he's
Mm.
like, and it turns out he carries this bag everywhere because
Mm.
Fran packs this lunch. So on airplanes, everywhere, yeah, this lunch bag is there.
Mm.
And he said simply to me, "Tell me about your childhood,"
Mm.
which is what you started with.
Mm.
And for whatever reason, and I think at this time in my life, I've just gotten a little bit more willing to be honest. I was just very, very truthful with him.
Mhm.
And wasn't looking for a job. As a matter of fact, I didn't even really completely understand there was a job. I thought, I could give advice on things he could work on for children. So I was
Mhm.
very, very honest with him. And at one point, I got so excited in the conversation. I'm known for my emphatic hand gestures, according to the New York Times. And so at one point, I like grabbed him by the arm, like I grab a patient when I'm really trying to connect.
Uh-huh.
And then I froze because everyone in the room looked horrified. And I went, "Oh my God." And I reprimand myself out loud. I go, "Don't touch the governor."
That's great.
And he just got this look on his face. And I remember going at the 30th floor, right? If I'm like scurrying off to the
Uh-huh.
elevator. And I thought, "Oh, they would never want to put me in front of a camera." And and that's like a true story.
Yeah,
And a half
yeah.
hour later, I get this text. He wants to meet again. And it was a very scary decision for me. I loved my work
Mhm.
at the Columbus Foundation. And I begged my boss, like, "Please, this is like the National Guard. I'm going off to war. I know that I have a chance to do something for public health.
Mm,
No one is going to care about this. It turned out the governor actually did. It turned out he lost a daughter in a car accident when she
mhm,
was 21.
mm,
At the time, he was a US senator in Haiti, and he ended up getting very involved in, the hardest country on the planet to work in. Ended up meeting Paul Farmer, who's one of my heroes. He's a
mm,
global health doctor extraordinaire, just died recently.
mm,
Very, very famous man who tackled AIDS in the hardest country in the world. Very similar kind of weird childhood too.
mhm,
Um, Father Tom Hagen, a priest from Princeton, is also there doing this work, and he and his wife started investing in schools. So oddly, most governors don't care. I don't care what party they're in. Public health is not at the top of their radar.
mhm.
Um, it's just not what you run for office on. But he actually wanted to change it. He realized that Ohio had some of the worst health outcomes in the country. And and so I thought, I don't agree with him on all policies by far.
Mhm,
But I'm gonna get in there and just see if there's anything I can do.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's, good for people to hear because I think oftentimes the politics are so divisive that it's hard
Right.
for us to see where there's overlap and
Right.
still, stay in the game and make peace to some extent,
Right.
at least with the differences. And as it pertains to the then pandemic, right? So now you're in this job
Right.
and the unthinkable happens and you're called to step up and lead. What I'm mostly curious about, because I think, a lot of the
Mm,
Amy Acton story, as it pertains to the pandemic has been watched and seen and talked about. But what I think does get talked about, and I really want to kind of get in there with you and understand,
mhm,
is this thing that's come up, a number of times since we've been talking about just being you and not falling into the trap of, well, you're a doctor or, you're a part
mm,
of a medical system and now you're a part of a political
mhm, mm.
environment. You
Right.
didn't change who you were. And that is what
Yeah.
people needed because you were somebody that they could identify with, they could understand, they could relate to, and so they would hear you, they would listen to you, and you could help them. And
Right.
I think that piece is so important. It's so undervalued. People are
Yeah.
chasing the polished package of whatever, you know, we've been sold. And that's just not real and it's not what we need. And you showed up, in
Right.
that authentic way. And I just want to, I want to hear you talk about that, whatever it is that comes to mind.
Well, I have to tell you, it was, a shock, walking in the state house for the first time. Again, the Ted Lasso thing is not a bad analogy because I
Mhm.
didn't know operative world. I mean, I didn't have words even yet. And
Mhm.
I think in people who come up through politics, they're so steeped in it. It's like the oxygen you breathe and you don't even know anymore. You just do things
Mhm.
because you're steeped in that world. So by sheer fact that I wasn't climbing a ladder, this hadn't been my career goal my whole life.
Mhm.
I wanted to do my service, my public service, and I also knew that I had lines I wouldn't cross.
Mhm.
And so that just gave me a very different advantage. And then the governor, again, I was very fortunate because he let me sit in on every budget very early on and find the health in everything that was
Mhm.
going on. Like I got to do things in that first year, even with a very conservative legislature. We passed Tobacco 21. I negotiated just sitting down with no script at all, was in a room with 88 counties and negotiated the opiate settlement so
Mhm.
that we would endow that, bringing things I'd learned elsewhere, not what you would normally do in politics. We
Mhm.
created an endowment because
Mhm.
the tobacco settlement, we knew that when the rainy days came, it got raided and it didn't go to prevention. We actually, as opiates were on the table, we were able to move that into a foundation so it lasts in perpetuity for Ohioans.
Mhm.
We were solving things different. We had huge Legionella outbreak, all these crises that were going on. But it was, so we're a year in and I'm finally just getting my sort of legs under me, like, this is what this world is.
Mhm.
And I heard right at the end of December, beginning of January of 2020, a woman from the World Health Organization talking about weird pneumonia in Wuhan.
Mm.
And it was her voice. So this goes back to my childhood. Like I pick up on things probably
Mhm.
that people don't
Mhm.
do. And there was something in her voice that just stood out to me. I was flying back from visiting my two boys that live in California. And I was watching now the stories of Wuhan were just beginning early
Mhm.
January. And I stood there in the airport and there were all these universities from Ohio holding up signs for students coming back from the
Mm.
break. And I'm like,
Mm.
oh, wow, like people are
Mhm.
taking an infectious disease. And if it's in Asia right now,
Mm.
it might be coming back with people. So I started to dig my team into it.
Mm.
I give us a lot of credit. We got way ahead on this. And then it turned out that I was a representative for the entire Midwest to the CDC through a group called ASTO. And I ended up being right at the end of February, I ended up in the White House with Mick Mulvaney. I mean, this again, these are rooms I never thought I would sit in. They
Mm.
knew me from other work I had done on a uranium enrichment plant here. I was sitting in a room with some of the best epidemiologists and virologists in the world. And you're right there on that precipice. The
Mhm.
stock market crashed for the second time. We had done these pandemic drills I had a beg that the governor's team, but they let me and we did these drills. Ohio was way out ahead. We had our whole cabinet do exercises in early February.
Mhm.
But I'm sitting there in this room and there's this one particular gentleman who's worked for like 8 presidents and he was shaking.
Mm.
And I'm like, it's it. Like
Yeah.
he's seeing things that he has not seen before. This is the real deal.
Yeah.
And it went around the room and everyone in the room had to say something of advice. And it got to me, and everyone had said all the virology stuff. And I looked Mick Mulvaney in the eye and I said, I think this is the higher angels moment. Like, please tell the president this is
Mhm.
the FDR
Mhm.
Churchill moment. Like, we're at war
Mhm.
with a common enemy. I used to teach in my public health classes, if only we were invaded by aliens,
Mhm.
we'd all of a sudden realize we're all on the same team.
Mhm.
There's this concept of one health, that animal health, human health, and the environment are one ecosystem. And a
Mhm.
zoonotic disease is a classic example of how those things all affect each other.
Sure.
And I said, this is the higher angels moment. I remember Mick Mulvaney
Mm.
like putting his head in
Mm,
his
mm,
hands. He
mm.
was gone 2 weeks later
Mhm. Mhm.
and removed.
Mhm.
But I remember getting on a plane. We came back. We went to Metro Health in Cleveland.
Mhm.
Um, we toured this infectious disease unit. The governor and I came out, and the press is sitting there, and the whole world is right on that edge. It was the weekend we made the Arnold Classic decision.
Yeah, I remember, yeah.
And I just said this promise again. I'm not media trained. And
Mhm.
again, to the governor's credit and
Mhm.
his team, I was never, ever scripted,
Mhm.
ever.
Mhm.
And I just looked at the press and I just said, because I, like everyone else, just wanted the truth.
Yeah.
And I said, we will tell you what we know as we know. I just made this promise, and the
Yeah.
governor did too.
Yeah.
And then we came out at 2:00 the next day on the Ohio News Network. I thought to myself, I comforted myself going, I don't know what I'm doing on the cameras and everything,
Mhm.
but no one will watch this. It's the
Mhm.
Ohio News Network at 2 p.m. No one's going to watch this. And we just started telling the truth. The second we told the truth, a bunch of scientists who had gone underground, that's been written about in Michael Lewis's book, and I'll
Mm.
tell someday after testifying, tell more stories. The best people in the world started coming to us.
Mhm. Mm.
And, there were serendipities.
Mm.
I hired a communications director. She started 4 days before the things really hit. We made that tough Arnold decision,
Mhm.
best decision
Mhm.
ever, but a very, very hard one to
Mhm.
make. 50 million loss in economy.
Mhm.
And followed with the Sweet 16 and just
Mhm.
endless stories I could tell you of hard decisions made thoroughly with all the best minds around the table grinding it out. I
Mhm.
mean, nothing was flip. It was all
Mm.
hard got. But her brother, it turns out the woman I hire, her brother had gone to my med school here in Ohio and had helped George W. Bush write the pandemic playbook. So
Wow.
what people don't know is after 9/11, they realized that the gravest security risk to this country,
Mhm.
put all the death and disease aside, security risk is either a biologic weapon or a pandemic.
Mhm.
It unmoors everything, as
Mhm.
we've now seen,
Mhm.
from the supply chains on.
Mhm.
We couldn't even get amoxicillin.
Mhm.
You couldn't get a 3M mask. You couldn't make it in this country because we didn't have the machine that could make the inner layer in this country.
Mhm.
Hospitals were outbidding hospitals. Countries were stealing our stuff at port.
Mhm.
Behind the press conferences was running a war
Mhm.
that was supposed to be run at the federal level
Mm.
according to this playbook
Mhm.
that was not being implemented.
Right.
And so all of a sudden it was on every governor to run the war.
Mhm.
And it turned out Rajiv and Kaya, her brother, I was able to call, and that led me to Carter Mecker, which led me to this whole group of scientists called Red Dawn. And I could get from the very best minds
Mhm.
the thinking behind the playbook. And
Mm.
that's what we were executing. It
Mm.
was the emergency brake you hope you never have to pull.
Mhm.
It was supposed to have all this wraparound for business and
Mhm.
how to keep, because there's always cascading consequences.
Mhm.
But what people don't know that when at that beginning in March, if you went in the hospital, chances of mortality were like 25%.
Mm.
By the time June came around, even 3 months later, it had dropped down to 5. Still horrible.
Mhm.
But that bit of time allowed the world to start to figure out
Mm.
what to do.
And what I'm struck by, and having asked that question and hearing your answer, is I think so much that people didn't see.
Right.
There's so much that you went through and your team went through, and you're a human being, right?
Right. Right.
With like,
Very normal.
a normal human being who
Right.
has a finite amount of energy and a family and other things, your
Right.
own history and past and trauma. And um, nobody really knows. I didn't know the extent of groups like Red Dawn and the people you're talking
Right.
to from around the world, the history going back to Bush and the politics, the,
Right.
the, the whole thing. I mean, there's so much there. What people saw was the humanity in you, the normalcy in
Right.
you, right? You somehow are able to show up and lead with incredible strength,
Mhm.
but it was sort of masked in just like truth and vulnerability and normalcy.
Right.
That's the genius of it all. And you might not like that word, to describe yourself, but it
Yeah.
is brilliance. It's genius, and it's in a different way than I think people think they're supposed to be.
Right.
That somebody should stand up in front of a camera with a script and get every word right and sound intelligent and right.
Right.
And that's not what you were, even though you had all that behind you.
Right.
You know, I don't know. I'm not even sure there's a question there, but I'm just moved in a different way. You were inspiring to so many people. The words. I mean, to talk about Viktor Frankl and Joseph Campbell. I mean, at a time like that, those are not things that people don't talk
People
about
do.
hero's journey.
Right, right,
I
right,
mean, um,
right.
I don't know. Any thoughts on it?
So all of this exploring and dabbling we do in life, it all came there was a morning where I literally had this feeling that everything that had ever happened in my life, like good and bad, was
Mm,
exactly what I needed.
mm,
And it was a very like, it was like
mm.
this. It was like because I would get up at 4 so I could have quiet time because
Yeah.
the calls would start at 6 with all the hospital CEOs, and
Mhm.
it was like, whew, like I
Yeah.
just knew, you know, you when you're in this position, you just don't want anyone to die. Like,
Yeah.
I felt like every single Highland was my responsibility, and I also knew that there was no amount of orders or anything you would do that would flatten the curve. The only way you can do it is by each of us helping one another.
Yeah.
And so my goal, the New York Times studied 7 weeks of our press conferences. They wrote in May of 2020 this article, "The Leader We Wish We All Had."
Mm.
Very, I'm honored, and I wish, to say I was as deliberate as they did this linguistic style analysis of looking at it. Another Kenyan professor said we created a ritualized holding space, which is what we did. Like, when
Mhm.
on earth does everyone all show up in one space like that?
Mhm.
But what I felt in the beginning was this feeling of we've got to pull everyone up on the life raft.
Mhm.
And so I've got to give people the information they need to check in on their neighbors, who's older,
Mhm.
to watch the nurse who has to work's child. I was trying to come up with things people could do. And they
Mhm.
said, we were brutally honest, vulnerable, and empowered people.
Mm.
And in many conversations since, there's these crisis communication Cs: be clear, concise, credible,
Mhm.
consistent, blah. But what I think we're missing right now, and our leaders were really, again, this pandemic is not, these times of disruption and unmooring are not over,
Right.
and they won't be over for a
No.
while.
Yeah.
Um, and there are pearls in it because we're learning things, we're unmasking things that were already going on. The
Mhm.
social movements we've seen. It's not all bad. Out of this disruption often comes the next great thing, and I see many, many wins and opportunities if we choose to be conscious moving forward out of this. But I think a time like this really calls for leaders, um, that higher angels piece. I don't know why I'm just so grateful it came to me, but I do think we need narratives and storytellers and people who make meaning out of all we're enduring.
Mhm.
And it's that's that type of leader. It's not very easy to be. It was easy for me because I didn't know better.
Mhm.
There
Mhm.
was a point at which I couldn't sign my name. I stepped down when I felt I could
Mhm.
no longer honor what I believe.
Mhm.
Um, and through pressure that was being put on the legislature, people don't know that,
Mhm.
real pressure from the Speaker of the House. You probably know,
Mhm.
January 6th people were in my yard. I had
Yeah,
executive
oh, yeah.
protection
Ugh.
24/7.
Yeah.
Um, all of that was very real and very ugly.
Mhm.
But what people also don't know is we have these gigantic mail rooms at the Department of Health and at the governor's office that you could not walk through for things people were making and sending. So
Mhm.
Ohioans came together and flattened the curve. Ryan Vessler did the t-shirt, "Not
Mhm.
all heroes wear capes,"
Mhm.
to support youth homelessness, something I
Mhm.
cared about. These memes started to spread, and Ohioans started to do stuff for one another.
Yeah.
And it was an amazing thing. The
Mm.
act on love, not hate signs.
Yeah.
I said something about a song that Michael Stipe did, "There's No Time for Love Like Now," on Colbert.
Mhm.
Next thing I know, I get a call from Michael Stipe.
Mm,
I'm just
mhm.
like,
Mm.
people
Mm.
people are longing.
Yes. Yeah.
And I keep saying, if most of us in a pandemic, infectious disease spread is like herd immunity. If most of us do the right thing enough of the time, all of us get through.
Mhm.
And just like any other power differential, like bullying prevention, domestic violence, the bystander matters. And all of us, I think, long. And it's really weird because, I was asked to run for office after and consider running for office. And
Mhm.
they were starting to poll me, but the numbers didn't look like a political party. It was
Mhm.
all over the
Mm.
spectrum.
Interesting.
And so I
Yeah.
do think there are these things that we all hold dear,
Mhm.
and we need people to help us
Mhm.
weave us back together again.
Amen. Yeah. And boy, did you do that, and you shined a light on how much that's needed and how it can be done. We're gonna run out of time here. So I wanted to make sure we talk about your current work and Rapid Five and
Oh,
what I'm um interested in is, going back to your interest in preventative medicine and seeing the importance of clean water and food and
right.
environment. And then, through the medical career, through the pandemic, you're seeing, including, your spiritual practices and your research on religion and,
Mhm.
you know, philosophy and spirituality, self-help, I mean,
Right.
mental health, right? You, I think, really are seeing and understanding how interconnected it all is.
Mhm.
And, to me, that's, becomes very spiritual,
Yeah.
because that's what I believe that, in fact, we are all one and that,
Right.
God is a divine intelligence that's not any one person. It's all of us,
Right.
connected collectively. And we've become so fractured and we've become so traumatized and so isolated. And it feels to
Yeah.
me like you are using your life, all of it, to try to bring
Mhm.
us to back together and doing it in the way that includes all of those things,
Right.
right? And maybe that brings us to rapid five, the nature aspect and
Right.
the health aspect. But anything you want to say about that work
Right.
and yeah, as we start to wrap up.
Well, I would say, it was an honor of a lifetime
Hmm.
to serve the way I did. I would do it forever.
Hmm.
It was again, it was a privilege to be in that moment. And then what do you do next?
Hmm.
Right? Like, after you do something like that. And I tried to stay very open. I didn't rush. I did my work on kindness
Hmm.
for the Columbus Foundation, was asked to consider running for US Senate, which I gave my wholehearted, like, quickest look at, but just
Hmm.
couldn't quite yet see. I just don't see myself in like operative, like type world. I couldn't
Hmm.
understand it all yet. I understand it a little more now. Um, and then I saw this book.
Hmm.
A friend of mine, Kirsten Carr, showed me the Rapid Five Vision, which was a process that occurred during the pandemic,
Hmm.
where there was this realization that um, one of the things that we've come out of the pandemic with, one is supply chain is changing and it's bringing a lot of amazing, manufacturing and things back. It's a really big moment for our state in so many ways, and I hope we cherish this in the right way. But also, we know we're going to grow in this region by 1 million people, but if we grow haphazardly, it's kind of like meh,
Hmm.
which is the default.
Hmm.
But during the pandemic, everyone rediscovered nature. Nature, I realized, was this one thing that everyone held in common. It's still common ground. Our Metro Parks attendance went through the roof.
Hmm.
Um, it's People were going to that for healing. It was also the safe place. And it's like the one thing that's left that's not partisan.
Hmm.
So I'd had this whole sense in myself. And then I see this book where they've reimagined that we don't have mountains or oceans here, but we have hidden in plain sight
Hmm.
145 miles of waterway, green spaces all around it. It was this vision of 5 design firms for creating the largest integrated park system in the country. But underneath it all, it led with joy and fun and
Mm,
recreation. But right under it was the social determinants of health. In
mm,
this book, first of all, 80% of these waterways are in public domain, and other cities which are way advanced, like Atlanta, Beltline, Houston Bayous, all
mm,
these places that have activated their waterways, they had to like buy every inch of parcel. And here we are, like with all
mm,
this in public domain.
mm,
But underneath it all, like some of the visions were for undoing redlining,
mhm,
reconnecting
mhm,
Hanford Village that had been cut by the Bexley Curve,
mhm,
bridges that would reconnect back to Alum Creek,
mhm,
those grain silos that are
mhm,
eyesores but are too expensive to remove become climbing walls.
mhm,
And all these visions were doing social determinants of health. It was small business creation along the corridors
mhm,
and an emphasis we have in the community on women led businesses and minority led businesses right now. It was rapid transit to take you east to west. It had all these packages, education, outdoor classrooms, aging in place. Like when I looked at it, it was public health,
yeah, right, there it is.
but it's leading. I mean, we
Yeah.
joke. I'm like, just kayaking.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Don't mind me.
Yeah, 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 well, sometimes maybe we have to come at it from a place where people, are. That's a big part
Right.
of what we've tried to do here at Gravity is,
Right.
right, like, we know that not everybody's gonna go to, I don't know, psychedelic assisted treatment or silent
Right.
meditation retreats, but can we catch them here with a little something,
Right.
a little bit of art or music or culture or meditation or yoga or
Right.
something that gets people in the door and a kayak,
Right.
a walk in a park,
Right.
right? It
And
doesn't have to be something, it can be very simple and
it's very simple.
accessible for
And
everybody.
making it accessible to everyone. So this
Yeah,
was all about our punchline is connecting us to nature and one another like never before.
that's
And
great.
there were art installations and history, and I learned that Alum Creek was the liquid path to freedom because the sycamores glowed at night. There's
Mhm.
all these things as it's wayfinding, and before you know it, restaurants wanna be
Mhm.
Rapid 5 and businesses wanna be
Right.
it because
Right.
it's a way of life.
Right.
And so what we have in this moment,
Yeah.
very unique moment in this region, and I do believe this will wag the whole state.
Mhm.
In this moment of growth is the exact time we have to claim this nature
Yes.
for generations to come,
I
and
agree.
that's the goal.
Well, that is a worthy goal, and I hope to be a part of it and
I hope you
support
will
you.
be.
Yes, and I would
And
love to be a part of it. I believe in it. I believe in you,
thank
and
you.
um, yeah,
Mm.
just thank you. Thanks
Aw,
for taking the time to be here, and thanks for leading our state and so many in the way that you are, just naturally. And
mhm.
I know it was hard, all of it. It's been,
Yeah,
it's hard, not
yeah,
just leading, but life.
right.
And you have shown up in a
Mm.
big way, and it's very inspiring, and it's important, and I'm excited to see what comes from this. I hope you'll run for office, uh, and write your book and do all that fun
Well,
stuff. But
yeah,
I know your mission and aim is always been the same, and however that
that's
manifests,
right.
I know will be important and right. So thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Any final thoughts? Anything else you want to share with the
No,
audience?
thank you
Yeah.
for spending this time. I hope we get to talk much more over the
Yeah.
years to come.
I look forward to it.